My guest at this time is Trent England. He is the director of Save Our States, which is a project of the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. You'll also hear him as a guest host frequently for Ben Shapiro, and so Trent is familiar to many of our listeners as well. He joins us today to talk about the ongoing fight over the Electoral College and even the broader question of why our states still matter and why a lot of people don't really understand that anymore. So, Trent, thanks very much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you, Greg.
Well, this has flared up in a number of different ways. It's obviously flared up after the 2000 and now the 2016 presidential elections because the Electoral College winner was not the same as the popular vote winner, even though the popular vote is not a constitutionally prescribed thing. But it's still an issue that has a lot of people frustrated, and it's understandable because it means the election was close and it didn't go their way. The latest Democrat to jump on the abolish the Electoral College train is South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who is now officially a Democratic presidential candidate. In fact, he mentioned this at his presidential campaign launch on Sunday in Indiana.
And we can't say it's much of a democracy when twice in my lifetime the Electoral College has overruled the American people.
And then he talked about it again with Rachel Maddow on MSNBC this week.
Most Americans don't want the conservative agenda that we're now seeing, the extreme agenda that we're seeing in Washington. In fact, it is precisely for that reason that they have to interfere with democracy with things like voter suppression or clinging on an electoral college that overrules the will of the American people. It is precisely because the American people, by and large, don't want what they're selling.
All right, so let's address his contention here right out of the gate, Trent, and that's that the Electoral College, if it doesn't match up with the popular vote, overrules the will of the American people. What's your response to that?
Well, it's really a silly thing to say because the Electoral College is based on exactly the same math as Congress. So, we don't decide who controls the House of Representatives based on the popular vote. We don't decide who controls the U.S. Senate based on the popular vote. Far from it, much farther from it than the Electoral College. I mean, we are a nation of laws. We have structures, and we don't decide things by plebiscite. So, I think it's just a shame that you have elected officials out there running around talking as if they've never taken seventh grade civics.
So for those who wonder why it's not just one person, one vote across the country instead of being divided up by Electoral College per state, explain why the founders did it and why you believe it's a better system than just having essentially a plebiscite, like you mentioned.
Yeah, the irony of the Electoral College is it probably worked even better than the founders thought it would, and it was one of the least controversial parts of the Constitution. Federalists liked it, Anti-Federalists liked it. Alexander Hamilton was able to say, if it be not perfect, it is at least excellent. What they wanted was a way to elect a president to make sure that he was independent from Congress. They didn't want Congress to elect a president. They didn't want the states to elect the president in terms of, having governors or legislators do it directly. They wanted the president to have some independence, but they based it on the same system as Congress, really. They wanted something so that one region of the country couldn't control the whole thing or be a spoiler in the whole thing. And they were very worried about regional candidates and, the kind of divide that eventually we did see that led up to the Civil War. I mean, they tried to craft a system that would prevent that. And frankly, we see it working in 2016. We saw it work in 2000. Hillary Clinton ran a pretty pathetic campaign. Even people on the left agree with that. She ran a narrow kind of sit-on-your-lead campaign, and the Electoral College says, you got to do better than that. You got to reach out. You've got to try to win, not just a raw popular vote majority from big cities on the coast. You've actually got to win some of Middle America to be a legitimate presidential contender. The same thing happened to Al Gore. He couldn't even win his home state in 2000 because his appeal was so narrowly confined to the biggest urban areas. And if I remember right, the county-by-county map, there were a few places, I think a few Indian reservations in South Dakota that were like the only sparsely populated parts of the country that Al Gore pulled up. That's the Electoral College working exactly as it's intended, protecting us from that kind of narrow regional politics.
Another aspect of this, Trent, that I think gets lost in the discussion because it's part of a larger discussion than just the Electoral College is the significance of the states themselves. With more and more power being concentrated in Washington, a lot of folks don't understand what the importance is of having states continue to have this power, whether it's in the Electoral College or in some other ways. We hear a lot of debate on the right about the 10th Amendment also, that powers not specifically granted to the federal government belong with the people and the states. So how have we lost that sense of that the federal government is essentially a product of the states and not that the states are the little brothers, essentially, of the federal government?
Yeah. Some of it is natural. Some of it is a result of people being much more mobile today and us having a, much more unified economy. And I mean, there are reasons why people are less tied to geography than we used to be. But you're right. I mean, we really have lost this idea that we want to be governed at the most local level possible, and we also want our governments to compete. And I really think this is actually the genius that created our country and really kind of supercharged the growth, the economic growth, the success of the United States in the 19th century is we had all these states. They did most of the governing, and they had to compete. So if one state had bad policies, ultimately people could up and move and go somewhere else. And we saw this. You can go back and find this in the 19th century and even into the 20th century, and some of it still happens today. People tend to move to lower tax states without an income tax. That, if you read what the left says, they talk about the evils of tax competition between states or between countries. They hate that because they hate for their policies to basically be hoisted by their own petard, right? They hate to get the comeuppance that comes from having bad tax policy or bad regulatory policy. And, as long as we maintain our system of states, and if we could get back to the founders' design of having most of our governance at the state level, the left's policies fail, and they're unsustainable in that world. We're in a world today where we still have our states. We kind of have one foot in the constitutional system, but the other foot is in this progressive administrative state system that wants centralized power so that people can't see just how bad their policies are.
I'm sure you've seen this effort by a number of states. It seems to keep growing little by little. I think we're close to enough states that they're almost at about 200 electoral votes where they've decided that whoever wins the national popular vote, that's who is going to win the Electoral College votes from their states. And as soon as they get to 270, which is the number needed to elect a president, they're all going to enter into this pact together. Obviously, there's a constitutional question about whether that's legal. What do you make of the effort, and do you think it'll survive a court challenge?
Yeah, so this is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, and you describe it as well as anybody can with this trigger where it would take effect if they get to 270 electoral votes. They have 289 right now. I do think it's probably unconstitutional, but I don't know that a judge would strike it down because there probably couldn't even be a lawsuit until you had an election and maybe even an election result under those rules. So I'm working really hard. This is really why I created the Save Our States Project, to stop this in state legislatures. Basically, they're going to state legislatures and saying, will you pledge to ignore how the people in your state vote and give away all of your state's presidential power to the national popular vote, which doesn't really exist? Every state would have to certify it on its own. There would be no uniform set of rules, no way to decide disputes, no way to have a national recount. I mean, it is so disastrous that even some folks on the left who would like to get rid of the Electoral College are opposed to the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact because they think it's dangerous. I agree with them. I think we should keep the Electoral College, either way. But no, it is really troubling to see these states adopting this as kind of, one more emblem of being the resistance, even though it is really bad policy.
Yeah, it's hard to know if it'll survive a court challenge, but the ultimate irony would be if what happened is they got to 270, flipped the switch on this thing, and then the party that they didn't want to become president won the popular vote, but not the Electoral College, and then see what happens to them. Because it was just in 2016 where a lot of people prior to Election Day thought Trump actually had a better chance of winning the popular vote than the Electoral College. So be careful what you wish for sometimes when you tinker with the Constitution.
Absolutely. This happened in Colorado in kind of in miniature in 2006. Democrats thought they were never going to win Colorado's electoral votes, but they were always getting kind of close. So they put a measure on the ballot to divide it up, make Colorado proportional. The voters in Colorado defeated it, said we want to keep the Electoral College here, our system the way it is. And in 2008, 2 years later, Barack Obama wins Colorado's electoral vote. So it just shows, people tend to fight the last war, and I think that's what you see with this national popular vote movement. People are trying to refight the 2016 election, and as you say, they could certainly wind up on the other side of that quite unhappy.
Trent, good to be with you today. Thanks for helping us understand the fight better. We'll talk to you later.
Yeah, thanks so much, Greg.
Absolutely. Trent England is director of Save Our States, a project of the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.